to this first seminar of a series of 3 different events on assisted human reproduction. As many of you may know, we do have an evening debate at 7 p.m. So particularly for those who are sitting uncomfortably in the back, at 7 p.m. there will be a lot of space because the event will be in the moot court room and is also freely accessible. Tomorrow during the day we have a full day conference for which you do have to register. You can still register online. So I would warmly encourage you, if you're interested in issues around gene editing. So a few speakers here will be presenting tomorrow at the conference as well. There will be a session on commercialization. There will be a session on anonymity and assisted human reproduction, anonymity of donors. There will be sessions on funding for in vitro fertilization, and issue simply also an update on legislative initiatives with a representative from Health Canada who will be speaking about the new draft regulations that have been issued a couple of days ago. So that's all tomorrow during the day. But today, for the Health Law Seminar, we're very happy to have Josephine Johnston and Chris Kaposi to focus on the issue of gene editing in a more lengthy discussion, focusing on the issue of parental responsibility. So I'll briefly introduce the 2 speakers. Josephine Johnston will then give a presentation. Chris Kaposi will then provide a commentary, and after that we'll open it up for questions with, as those who attend regularly know, priority with some questions from the students who take this seminar as a course. So very brief, Josephine Johnston is Director of Research and Research Scholar at the Hastings Center, which many of you may know, an independent research institute in Garrison, New York, which is a leading center on bioethics. She works on the ethics of emerging biotechnologies, particularly in human reproduction, psychiatry, and genetics. Her scholarly work has appeared in leading medical science, policy, law, and bioethics journals. She's co-editor of a book that is directly on topic, Human Flourishing in an Age of Gene Editing, which is forthcoming with Oxford University Press in 2019, and also Trust and Integrity in Biomedical Research, the Case of Financial Conflict of Interest with Johns Hopkins University Press. She's written extensively for the media, New Republic, Stat News, Time, Washington Post, and The Scientist. Is frequently interviewed on these issues in the media as well. And she is on Twitter. And I also noticed she exemplary brings her own food container, which I often feel is something we should start introducing here. Chris Kaposi is an associate professor of bioethics and faculty of medicine of Memorial University. He has interest in the ethics of disability and reproduction, and he's the author of a book that was featured in an op-ed piece also in the New York Times that some of you may have seen, which I sent around, Choosing Down Syndrome, Ethics in New Prenatal Testing Technology, MIT Press 2018. Chris teaches in the Masters of Health Ethics program. He's also a clinical ethicist with the Provincial Health Ethics Network of Newfoundland and Labrador. So without further ado, Josephine.
I'm going to stand up because people are far away, which is amazingly nice for me. So first things first, as you maybe can tell, I'm not from here. I'm not even from Western Ontario. I'm actually from New Zealand. So this is a picture of where I grew up on the Otago Peninsula near the city of Dunedin in New Zealand, Aotearoa. And but I find myself and have found myself for the last almost 20 years working in North America. So mainly in the United States and mainly at the Hastings Center, which is in this beautiful location in Garrison, New York. We actually did have a snowfall recently, but this is a middle of winter picture, which is a very beautiful location, just about an hour north of New York City. I actually first worked in the United States in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I worked for 1.5 years in Halifax. So I always have to say North America because I've worked for 1.5 years in Canada 15 years ago. The Hastings Center is a kind of unusual place. I'm just going to quickly tell you what it is. It's an independent research institute. It was founded in 1969, so that's 50 years ago, when a bunch of things that might sound familiar were kind of coming up, like first sets of organ transplantations, questions about the definition of death, psychosurgery, a bunch of issues around reproductive ethics which we still haven't solved. And it's located in this big old building. And we do research, so we're researchers primarily. We don't really teach, although some people teach on the side, in two big areas, just and compassionate healthcare and wise use of emerging technologies. And we're interested in ethical issues, policy issues, some legal issues, and questions of social norms and practice. We do a whole lot of different projects funded by different people on lots of different topics. So if you're interested in this whole area of bioethics, like, it's a good place to go look it up. Here's one we have on creating systems of safety for immigrant health, because as you may know, in the United States, immigrants, so-called illegal aliens, don't get health care rights mainly, or are served in really indirect ways. And right now, there are serious questions about how to deal with immigrants who are in detention facilities who need health care, so that's a pressing issue. And then, a wholly different kind of thing about public deliberation on the release of genetically modified organisms in the wild. So just to say, it spans a huge range of different issues, and the colleagues move on. We also publish 2 journals. The first one here, is the Hastings Centre report, which is a pretty broad journal, and it does have issues in it that are legal issues, and it's an at-law column, so if you're law people, there's stuff in there for you, but it's also looking more broadly at ethics and policy. And we also publish special reports inside of that are thematic, so on a big issue. So this is one that we just published on the ethics of sequencing newborns, so the use of sequencing technology in newborn babies. And so it's a big topic, and it's a long treatment of those questions. Here's another one on what makes a good life and end of life, so looking beyond, looking at all different issues around the end of life. And then we have this journal, which has been called IRB Ethics in Human Research, and is being relaunched in January as Ethics in Human Research, and it's about any issue related to human subject research. And we also have a blog. So we look at a bunch of different things. One of the things that we have a project on right now is this one here, which is about, I forgot the title for, I'm sorry, which is on human flourishing and gene editing. And as Trudeau said, that's where this book, which is going to have a way better cover than that, Human Flourishing in an Age of Gene Editing, will be coming out next year. And so the work that I'm going to talk about is a chapter I wrote for the book that I'm co-editing on this sort of under this broad umbrella of what human flourishing has to do with technologies like gene editing. And the reason we framed it in terms of human flourishing is that there's a lot of facility in our culture and in our society and in our legal system to deal with questions of safety and efficacy with new technologies. So there are mechanisms to assess safety and efficacy. How well does this thing work? How safe is it? There are many interesting ways in which those mechanisms function or don't function properly. But there's a very, very sort of fluent language and concepts for thinking about safety and efficacy. This book is addressing this question of whether or not we have, or it's sort of based on the premise that we don't have that same kind of fluency for thinking about things outside of safety and efficacy that address human well-being or human flourishing. And so that's why we wanted to focus in that area. So if I said to you, look, gene editing is safe and effective, like it's really good, it works fine, do you still have any qualms? And what language do you even have to address those? So some of the ways that people address that is like, they say, well, I feel like I'm playing God, or it feels like it's unnatural or against nature. And so we took up some of those kinds of concerns and asked ourselves whether there were other ways of talking about, whether there's a secular modern language for talking about those kinds of concerns that don't usually have a lot of purchase in policy and practice, but are often felt deeply by ordinary people when you stop them on the street and ask them about these kinds of technologies. So that's what the book's premise is. It's focused on gene editing. These are two of the inventors of the new gene editing tool, CRISPR-Cas9. So who's not heard of that? I feel like it's gotten so much pretty, yeah. Okay, so this is Jennifer Doudna on the right and Feng Feng on the left. They're two of 4 people who are really credited with discovering CRISPR-Cas9 and its potential use in mammalian cells. And this is a kind of the dream, in a way, of genetics, or some genetics research, has been not just to be able to understand the genetic basis of differences between humans, including disease, not just to be able to see it, to sequence it, to see the letters, but to actually be able to go in and make changes. And CRISPR-Cas9 is not the first technology to make changes to genes, but it is the one that is receiving a huge amount of attention right now because it is in many ways more effective and much easier to use than anything that preceded it. I don't want to give you a really thick description of how it works. There are better people to do that. There are videos online that explain how CRISPR-Cas9 works, and how gene editing happens, but the basic thing here is that you get the ability to cut DNA, which means you can delete some DNA, or you can replace it with new DNA. So you have the ability to, edit is the right metaphor for it. And the interesting and I think really powerful thing about this is you can make multiple changes at multiple sites, which was not really possible with the previous technologies, and you can do it in any kind of cell. So it really is like able to be used across cells. This was a mechanism that existed in bacteria, how bacteria protect themselves from viruses by doing this, but it turns out you can actually use it in any kind of cell. So human cells or animals, non-human animals, or even bacteria. What I'm interested in is the use in humans. There are a whole bunch of people, including colleagues of mine, who are looking at non-human animals, including things like mosquitoes. So in humans, the uses are huge, right? So you could use them to make changes to germ cells, sperm and eggs. You could use them to make changes to embryos, fetuses, babies, children, or adults. So massive potential uses. Sometimes those uses are discussed as being germline uses, so uses that would actually make a change that was in all the cells or in all the germ cells, and therefore be heritable, be able to be passed on. And then, many changes that could happen in born humans would not be heritable. They would be somatic changes. They would be changes in that person, but not necessarily changes that they would pass on. So that's sometimes a division that's made. When CRISPR-Cas9 was first announced, it received gigantic amounts of press coverage. I asked a colleague, a scientist I know, who uses this in his work with mosquitoes, what it was like when CRISPR-Cas9 was announced. And he said that there was a conference that he was going to a couple of months later, and they just scrubbed the entire program to talk only about CRISPR-Cas9. And so I said, is that because it completely changed how you think about everything? And he was like, no, it's the same way of thinking, it's just a way better way of doing it, so we all had to just learn how to do it. So it was not a paradigm shift in terms of the idea, like the idea being the same, you can make changes to genes, but a massive change in terms of the efficiency and ease with which that can happen. And so in the scientific community, communities are sort of public-facing science journals, but in the scientific, generally it was like, wow, this is huge, like it's going to be able to be used across different platforms, and there was a lot of excitement that it would make a lot of things better, right, really quickly. But there was also, of course, immediately also people thinking about potential uses in humans, and especially reproductive uses. And these are much more sort of fearful and concerned kind of images that accompany the thought of using this kind of thing to make changes to children or to future persons. And even to the point where people were asking already, like way before it's actually been used, it's only been used in human embryos a few times now in China and in the US. But someone in the Atlantic is wondering, will editing your baby's genes be mandatory? So if it's possible to do, will you actually have a really strong obligation to do it? And that's a big part of what motivates what I want to talk about today. So I've kind of gotten now up to my chapter, and so how many people were given this to read in advance? I wasn't quite sure. Okay, so some people were given it to read, and some people of those read it. I'm going to ask you that question. So I'm going to refer to this chapter, but I'm assuming, rightly assuming that not everybody has read it. So what motivated my chapter, or the thing I want to talk about today, is this idea that editing your baby's genomes will be in some sense mandatory. And in order to address that, I am coming at it in a very particular way. So that gets at this idea of parental obligations and what it might be like to be the kind of future parent, some of you may be in this category, who feels that this is something that they have to do, or indeed who has some sort of enforced obligation to use the technology. Okay, so let me just see. In particular, what I'm interested in is not so much the question of what it might be like for future children or future persons whose genes have been edited. I think that's a really important question. What would it mean to be someone whose genes were edited by someone else in advance of being born? And a lot of people are asking that question. But I'm also really interested in the impact on prospective parents of this particular kind of technology. So even though prospective parents, their own genes may not be involved in this technology, or they probably would have to have their genes sequenced, but they might not, so they are not really the direct subjects of the technology, I still think there are really important ways in which their own experiences, their lives and interests are at stake, and that they, in fact, even if they're not the ones on whom the technology is used, can nevertheless be directly impacted and possibly even changed by the very existence of this kind of technology in a reproductive space. Okay. So what I want to say about this stuff is also connected to other technologies. So gene editing is not something that that's currently offered to parents who are prospective parents. But there are other technologies that are offered that are very, very related and raise many of the same kinds of questions from the perspective of parents. So this is a picture of newborn screening card, Guthrie card, that probably every baby in Canada, certainly almost every baby in the United States, has a blood spot taken. And there have been lots of questions now about whether or not we should sequence those genes using genome sequencing, sequence those blood spots using genome sequencing technology, and really discover far more about the genetic makeup of the child than these current newborn screening technologies look at. Similarly, this is a screenshot from a non-invasive prenatal testing company, SEEMAN, which offers maternity 21. That was the first non-invasive prenatal test to be offered in the United States. That's a blood test of the pregnant person that is then analysed, and fragments of fetal DNA are found in the blood in animals. And it's a new way of doing prenatal screening. It's not just available in Canada. So, I mean, in America here is the New Zealand company's Prenatal Peace, non-invasive prenatal genetic screening tests. It's Canadian, in Canada you can get the Harmony test, or the Panorama test through this. So I did some Googling this morning to see what your options are for accessing non-invasive prenatal tests. These tests, these new kinds of prenatal screening, they're also carrier tests, they all raise this question, I think. What are the obligations of prospective parents to use or not use these technologies? Most of these technologies, and I'll say something about gene editing in a second, but these prenatal testing technologies, carrier screening technologies, newborn sequencing, they're optional, right? You can say no. So if it's really up to parents to decide whether or not to use these technologies, I'm interested in knowing more about what will shape that decision making. And in particular, I'm interested in the idea that notions of good parenting, what it means to be a good parent, will drive that decision making, and I'm kind of curious to know what that really might mean, and I'm seeking to sort of enrich our understanding of what good parents do in the face of these different kinds of technologies. Okay, oh yeah, so I'm going to back up a second here, because in the context of gene editing, I need to say why I think prospective parents might actually have the option of altering the genes of their children. Now, any law student who's looked at this Assisted Human Reproduction Act in Canada knows that you actually can't do that today in Canada. It's illegal. And it's not just in Canada, there are a number of countries around the world, Brazil, Australia, many European nations, that have legal prohibitions on altering the genes of a future person, of an embryo or a fetus, or even germ cells, in a way that will make a heritable change. There's not quite the same law in the US, so people who... I'm from New Zealand. We have a legal system kind of like you have here. When I first got to the US and I saw how they regulate this kind of stuff, it sort of blew my mind. But this is a quintessential example. You can't read this, but this is the Dickie Wicker Amendment. So one of the ways that the US regulates stuff in this area is by having prohibitions on what you can do with federal money, which doesn't say anything about what you can do with non-federal money. But there is this standing prohibition against using federal money to do anything that harms or alters a human embryo. So that's a huge impediment to researchers in the United States developing gene editing technology, especially germline gene editing technology, because they can't use federal money to do it. But Some of them have done it anyway, right? So just like they did embryonic stem cell research without using federal money, there is a way around this, but it's like one of the ways that this is regulated. Perhaps the more important right now is that since 2015, there has been a prohibition on the FDA considering any clinical application and to use gene editing, to change the genes of an embryo or fetus. So that has far-reaching implications. It's not just something that impacts people who have federal funding. It's anybody who wants to go to the FDA for permission to offer a clinical service of gene editing in the reproductive sphere. So right now in the US, it's also not something that you can offer. Totally different though, like not regulated through the criminal law, right? Like yours is a really different mechanism, which is of interest to law students probably. Still, even with all these barriers in place, we know that determined and well-resourced parents will work around these controls and find jurisdictions where this is not prohibited, right? You even saw that in the US, where a researcher went to Mexico in 2016 to do mitochondrial replacement, which is a different kind of technology, but similar, right? One where you change the mitochondrial DNA of the embryo. So even American physicians find ways around this, and certainly well-determined parents find ways around, and well-resourced parents find ways around these kinds of prohibitions. Today, you can see that in assisted reproductive technologies and the tourism and other issues. So there will be parents, eventually, if this is proven to be a safe enough and effective enough technology, there will be parents who are asking themselves, is this something I want to do? Is this something I should do? And if so, how can I do it? Where can I go? I also think that if it's shown to be safe and effective, there will be significant pressure on those prohibitions to relax them at least somewhat. So in the United Kingdom, in the last few years, they changed their law to accommodate mitochondrial replacement technologies. They had a law prohibiting germline changes or genetic changes. I can't remember the language exactly, but it certainly caught mitochondrial replacement technology and prevented the use of that technology. And they had a huge debate in Parliament. They had debates, they had consultations by the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority around the United Kingdom, and they ultimately took a vote in Parliament and changed the law to allow for mitochondrial replacement technology, which is allowing for a kind of germline or heritable genetic modification. Part of the way that happened was that they had multiple families, women who stood up and told Parliament of the children they had lost, of the pregnancies they had lost, and of the suffering that they had endured on account of mitochondrial disease. And that proved to be very, very persuasive to members of Parliament, but also the general public. So from the beginning of the process to when they took the parliamentary vote, lots of people changed their position on this issue because of the really compelling stories. And I'm not trying to suggest that that's wrong. I think it was actually a bit of a success story for public deliberation, but it definitely demonstrates the power of strong stories of suffering to change this kind of law. So if gene editing is effective, I do think that many jurisdictions will relax, if not completely do away with their standing prohibitions on germline modification. If that happens, I think that the decision will likely rest with parents and prospective parents. They will be the ones to decide, they will have the authority to decide whether or not to alter the genes of their prospective children, and if they do it, in what ways, which genes, in what ways, for what things. How will they decide? Well, we can have a huge discussion about that question. I think lots of things will influence people's decision making, and no two decisions will be the same. Yet, if you look at patterns of decision making about the use of other genetic technologies in similar contexts, so these reproductive, prenatal testing, use of sequencing in newborns, you see that among other considerations, the idea of good parenting, of what a good parent would do, the sort of virtue question of what ought one do, what would be good to do, will definitely play a role, I predict. And there's a bunch of research that I could draw on, but I'm actually going to highlight work led by James Anderson, who's standing up in there. James. Hi, James. That was done here in Toronto. So in this study, which was published in 2016 in the Journal of Medical Ethics, and James can correct us in the question time, but I see in this study this idea of good parenting at work in people's decision making. So let me just say a little bit about the study. So this is a study at the Hospital for Sick Kids right here, in which genome sequencing was offered to parents whose children had been referred to the hospital's genome clinic for conventional genetic testing. So they'd been referred for some reason, something was going on, and it seemed like it would be a good idea for them to do a genetics consult and get tested. And they were offered this much bigger kind of test than the kind of standard genetic testing where you just look at particular genes of interest or things that you think might be going wrong. Genome sequencing, much, casting the net much wider. All the parents who agreed to have their children's genome sequenced were informed that researchers would return to them any news of any variant that's known to predict a childhood onset disorder. So if they were there for sort of X problem, if we found this Y thing, which is another childhood condition, that would be returned, whether or not they had found anything relevant to X. So on childhood onset conditions. So then the parents were given the option of electing to learn whether their child carried gene variants associated with a number of medically actionable adult onset disorders. And they could also learn whether they themselves carried these same gene variants. So in this study, most of the parents elected to learn these additional results about their children, even though if they opted not to learn the same thing about themselves. So just think about that for a second, right? So adult onset conditions, they are medically actionable, parents opting not to learn it about themselves, which is a phenomenon that's well documented outside of the study, right? People do not want to know certain things about their own genes, but they do opt to find that out about their child. So why? Well, researchers who interviewed the parents to ask them about these decisions reported that many of the parents expressed actually quite a bit of ambivalence about getting this additional information, which they realised might be difficult to deal with in a number of ways, yet they agreed to receive the additional results about their children because of, and this is a quote from the study, a perceived moral obligation to learn to the extent possible the full range of current and future risks for their children, no matter how unpleasant. And the researchers called this an inflicted ought, the sense that people inflict on themselves that they really ought to do this thing that they know is going to be hard and unpleasant. And it was so powerfully felt by the parents in this study that the researchers concluded, faced with this opportunity to receive and this expanded set of results, parents felt they had no choice. So really strong sense in the study and in other studies, in the prenatal testing context, we see the same thing, a really strong sense that what one ought to do is maximise one's use of these technologies and find out as much as possible. Well, of course, you won't be surprised to learn that that idea is very much in concert with companies like 23andMe and what they think about genetic testing and genomics and what it can offer. So here's Anne Wojcicki talking about, she's the founder and CEO of 23andMe, talking about genetic testing generally, and she says, I tested my son as soon as he was born, and I tested my daughter's amniotic fluid, so she did, amniocentesis. Genetic testing is a responsibility if you are having children. So very strong language around the idea that you need to use these technologies if you are contemplating reproducing. Hang on, I'll just get to him in a second. If you look at non-invasive prenatal tests, the websites for those companies, you also see a lot of language in there that gets at the idea that this is what good parents do, this is good mothering, images of sort of idealized mothers and children are in a lot of these websites. A study of this internet advertising for non-invasive prenatal tests was very critical of the language used as being, like, there's so many things one can say about the way these things are advertised, but it's misleading in a bunch of ways. But one of the things that the researchers who looked at this analysis said is that they thought it should be mandatory for companies to clarify that no prenatal test can guarantee the health and well-being of a baby. So this, if you think about what these tests are, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that nothing about the test is going to guarantee the health and well-being of your baby, right? It just tells you stuff about their genes. But people felt that they felt that the websites were so misleading that people might actually think that they have to use this technology because it will actually help their child's health. That's the kind of language and ideas that are swirling around that area. Well, it turns out that the person in charge of the National Institutes of Health in the US, which is like the biggest funder of biomedical research in the world, Francis Collins, is also super keen on genomics and the use of genomics in all sorts of contexts, including, he doesn't talk about reproduction, right? So I'm going to talk about that for reasons that you can probably imagine. But he loves the idea of using genome sequencing in newborns And if you would sequence your newborn, why wouldn't you sequence prenatally? Like, it's only a matter of months difference, right? So he says in 2010, he's certain that whole genome sequencing will become a part of newborn screening. We'll look back and be like, why did we screen for so few things? Still really keen. This is from 2014. He thinks that the availability of cheap, efficient DNA sequencing technology will lead to a landscape in which every baby's genome is sequenced, and that information is used, very optimistically here, to shape a lifetime of personalised strategies for disease prevention, detection and treatment. And there are even people who go further and think that we could use it to shape kids' educational experiences and aspects of the home life. So this idea, he's not going to say that, he's probably not going to force this on people, like he hasn't said this, but I don't think he's in favour of mandatory genome sequencing of every newborn baby. Not quite the Gattaca scenario. But presumably he thinks that everyone would choose it, right? He's so convinced of the benefit of it that he thinks that people would choose, parents would choose this. Like I said, there's no reason apart from politics why he wouldn't say the same thing in the prenatal context. This idea that good parents choose to use genetic technologies to the maximum extent, I think rests on a bunch of dubious notions, but one of them is, the one that I want to talk about, the one I think is actually less obvious, is that such use of the technology will benefit the child or the future child. Right? Embedded in all of these people's enthusiasm is a sense that this will be good for the child. And there's a clever way to show why prenatal testing doesn't benefit the child. Right? There isn't really anything you can do only right now in terms of benefiting the fetus, but in most cases. But the case that gene editing could benefit the child or the future child could actually be very strong. Right? So showing that if we knew something and we could intervene either with the embryo or with the germ cells or even in utero, that could benefit the future child by editing genes associated with disease or disability, or even just things that are socially desirable and undesirable, genes that affect height, educational attainment. There are many genes that are starting to be put together that show an association with educational attainment. Editing those genes on a particular way of thinking could indeed be very beneficial to the child or future child. So if the technology works well, and I know that's a big thing, we can talk about it, but I don't think it's the most interesting thing actually. And if scientists and companies support the notion that using the technology will promote a child's welfare, that it's not just consistent with good parenting, that it's actually constitutive of good parenting, then you would very quickly potentially reach a point where utilising the technology is not simply a choice or even an opportunity for parents and prospective parents, not merely something that good parents can do for their children, but a new responsibility of parenting, something that good parents ought to do. And what I want to argue is that creating that situation actually places really significant burdens on parents that are almost never mentioned in these discussions, and that are really, really significant and belong in the debate. So where am I? Okay, potential burdens on parents. In my paper, in the chapter, I go through these in some detail, but I'm not going to spend very much time on any one of them except the last. You can ask me about them if you have questions. So potential burdens on prospective parents, who I think are kind of invisible, honestly, in this conversation, usually. Physical, right? So a lot of this would actually be, right now, done via IVF. That is not insignificant in terms of the physical burdens on the person who's producing the eggs and going through the transfer. So really significant, potentially physical burdens. Time burdens for doing IVF, time burdens for sitting down with your physician and talking about the sequencing, about the testing of the embryos, understanding all of the different things that are being communicated to you, trying to decide what you're going to do. Huge time burdens, not actually how people reproduce today. Most pregnancies are sort of unplanned, whatever that means. This isn't how people reproduce right now, and much, much more time consuming. Cognitive burdens, there's actually some evidence of this, like the sort of burnout that you get when you receive huge amounts of information about gene and gene variants of varying levels of penetrance and uncertainty, like how to even make sense of that. If you look at the choice literature and in psychology, you see that more choice is often actually really, really difficult for people to even process, and I'm not being mean about us, but I think like we have good reasons that we don't deal well with like gigantic amounts of really uncertain and varied information. Emotionally, very, very difficult potentially. In the prenatal context, there's data showing that in context, when people are, so there's some use of sequencing technology in prenatal testing in a research context now. And in the course of doing this, people receive information often about themselves or about their partners, and it can be very disruptive to relationships. It can be very taxing and distressing. It can also be very, useful, but like there's an emotional content to this, and it can be quite onerous. But the one, and financial, right? Like, is this going to be part of what people feel they have to provide for their children if it's not provided for by the state? So, I live in the US, and when I first got there, people were like, oh yeah, we put aside like $60,000 for our daughter's wedding, and we put like aside $150,000 so our kids could go to college each. And I was like, where do you get the money from? So the idea that, it could be that parents are supposed to come up with the funds, the tens of thousands of dollars that might be necessary to use this technology. So big financial issues really won't, if it comes out of pocket, it will obviously also not be something that people can equally access. But the one I want to talk about a little bit more is identity and values. Okay. So some uses of gene editing technology in reproductive contexts, I think, might conflict with prospective parents' identities or their values, such that using the technology could require them to act against their values or their deeply held beliefs. There are a couple of examples I want to give of this. One of them is that the use of the technology could actually conflict with your views and your feelings and your commitments about the nature of disability. So a prospective parent who sees disability, or at least some disabilities, is thoroughly consistent with flourishing, who would be could be faced with a decision where they're asked to, or given the opportunity to, for instance, edit genes associated with deafness or with some kind of physical disability, perhaps albinism, something to do with blindness, and suddenly you're actually implicated in acting against what might be your value, which is that it shouldn't matter. And these are significant, I think, conflicts for people in the course of their life story. Another one might be your understanding of the nature of parenting, right? What you think parenting is about. For this prospective parent, perhaps the parenting role privileges acceptance over control, makes them reluctant to use gene editing technologies because being a parent who knows this much about and exercises this much control over their child's genes conflicts with how they think about themselves and what they think they're doing, right? So some people don't see having children as kind of making, right, or fixing this person, but actually accepting, about being surprised, about receiving, about being kind of the recipient of this unknown. So that gene editing in the reproductive context would give us the option that prenatal testing and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis somewhat give us, but to much greater extent, this idea that we can actually control aspects of our future child, that we can fix them if they're broken in some way. And this way of thinking about what parenting is really in conflict with how a lot of people actually think about parenting. So you can look at various studies of like what people think about designer babies and stuff like that, and people will raise these questions about like, I don't know if I want to play God, or like that doesn't seem like the right kind of thing for me to be doing. In one of the studies referenced in the book that we are going to be publishing, someone who ran focus groups, I think in the UK, reported that some people said that too much control risks compromising a fundamental feature of parenthood, one that benefits parents as much as it does the future child, and this is this idea of just not being in control of everything. These burdens on parents, all of them, but including this one at the bottom here about your values and your identity, are seldom acknowledged, and they won't be experienced by all parents equally, right? Like not all prospective parents will be similarly impacted by those. Some of them will be fine about it. If you're the kind of person who fully subscribes to what Chris in his book I think calls sort of a neoliberal kind of capitalist mentality about maximizing the sort of productiveness of your future child, this stuff may not at all conflict with your identity and your values, but I want to suggest that it's not how everybody currently thinks about this. Now, does this potential clash between the best interests of future children and the flourishing of prospective parents matter? If you're the kind of person who thinks that parents a good parent's sole obligation is to further the best interest of your child, then no, right? Like if what we think good parenting is just about the best interest of children, then why do we even care about this? It doesn't matter. And that is actually how we often talk about what parenting is about. But if we think, and this is what I think obviously, that good parents also need to take their own interests as persons into account in these decisions, then yes, the burden on parents is relevant to understanding what good parenting might mean in an age of gene editing. And I'm going to just super fast go through this, but I want to tell you that it's not just the CEO of 23andMe or the head of the NIH who thinks that genetics is an sort of unbridled good and something that should be used. There are people in philosophy and ethics who've been arguing for a long time that the best interests of children require parents to use these technologies in ways to sort of make sure that they come out right? So this is Ron Green saying that we should strive to give our children lives unimpaired by serious genetic disorders, and that we should take reasonable care not to avoid doing so by inadvertence or neglect. So essentially saying if you don't do this, it's a kind of neglect, right? It's a neglectful parenting. People know this guy, Julian Savulescu, is really famous for this idea of procreative beneficence, the idea that you actually have, you should select the child who's going to have the best possible life, and he has a very specific way of thinking about what the best possible life is. It's like, the most success, the most happiness, and very utilitarian perspective. It's not just people who are in favour of this kind of selective mentality who use the best interests of children as their sort of grounding idea, but it's also actually some of the critics of reproductive genetics also are really grounded in best interests of children. So this is not Jürgen Habermas, this is Adrian Ash, but Jürgen Habermas, who's critiqued genetic technologies, has said that he thinks it would damage the child's relationship to the parent, right? So again, it's a child-focused criticism. Adrian Ash and Michael Sandel, so here's Adrian Ash, who are opposed to excessive use of genetic technologies, if not all uses. I think it's not part of the norms of parenting. It's not what good parenting is, because good parenting includes fostering and supporting in her words, the uniqueness of individual children. Again, still actually about what good parents do qua children, right? How they are to their children. So essentially, I think, a best interest of children standard. And here's Sandel saying that we should appreciate children as gifts. He's actually a little more getting in the direction of where I'm headed about how it is for us, but it's not explicitly focused on parents' well-being or flourishing. I think it's going to be hard to actually do this work of helping parents think, and prospective parents think about their own interests as persons inside of this context. So to help prospective parents, I think we need to provide them with real choice. And by real choice, that's my shorthand for actually supporting people to not use the technologies, and not just in the moment in the clinic supporting them, but having social policies in place that make it possible for them to choose otherwise. Which means routinization and social pressure are real problems, as are this is Canada, right? So I'm you probably got this all figured out. But I live in the United States where there's significant problems for people who have children with various different kinds of genetic conditions or genetic differences. I think people are going to need help to reflect on their own interests as part of what parenting involves. And this can happen in the clinical context, but it can also happen in churches, it can happen in friendship circles, it can happen on Facebook, it can happen in universities, it can happen through the arts. So actually, I think the arts is really good at this. If you look at Gattaca or Westworld or any of these dystopian films, they're reflecting on some of this stuff really pretty well. They're the only people who take some of this seriously. And of course, I think you need supportive laws, policies and practices surrounding this so that people really do have the option of choosing a different way of thinking about what this is all about. Oh, look, I put myself up here because I was like, well, if other people's photos get in my show, why not me? Good prospective parents have responsibilities to future children and themselves. I don't think this should be controversial, but I actually think it's almost never said. The burdens that gene editing could place on them, i.e. on prospective parents, are relevant considerations to their decisions about whether and how to use these technologies. It's not selfish to think about your own interests and your own life story and how you are as a person in this context. It's actually incumbent on the rest of us to recognise the burdens that come with this technology and to be open to supporting parents who act to protect their own flourishing in that context. And here I am with my own little bundle of joy. Thank you very much.
Very good. Chris?
Okay. Thank you, Trudeau, for the invitation to comment on this excellent paper, and thank you, Josephine, for the opportunity. I'm going to be a little bit of a wet blanket and maybe second guess some of the claims that you're making in your argument, but I think that's in the interest of furthering the discussion. Okay, so Josephine imagines a future in which gene editing becomes possible as a way of repairing and improving your children's genes. I think she makes a very central claim based on a prediction that editing your child's genes in the future will become a norm of good parenting. So not necessarily a legal requirement, but strong social pressure to edit their genes. And she outlines pretty clearly how and why this would be particularly burdensome to parents. She outlines physical burdens, cognitive burdens of understanding genetic information provided by sequencing. It would be burdensome financially, and it also might conflict with values. So she draws the conclusion, consequently, that we need to also include the well-being of parents in thinking about what it means to be a good parent, and particularly with the availability of new reproductive technologies like gene editing. So the central claim that I want to focus on is this prediction that editing your children's genes would become sort of quasi-mandatory, become considered to be a norm of good parenting. And I'm going to propose that maybe the prediction won't come true. And what really is at stake here is, I think, it matters how gene editing is delivered, how it's operationalized in the clinic. If it's delivered in a way that's particularly burdensome, then I think those burdens actually suggest that undergoing gene editing or having one's child's genes edited will not become somehow mandatory. So she does such a good job outlining the burdens, and this suggests to be if it's so burdensome, then there are reasons why gene editing won't be considered to be mandatory. And if you look at the physical burdens alone, I think this suggests this possibility. I was kind of on the edge of my seat when Josephine was talking because the comments that I kind of developed here were based on her written text, and she kind of didn't read the whole thing, and she kind of skipped over some of the parts that I'm commenting on particularly. But I think so. I'll kind of fill in the blanks here. So as I said, it matters how gene editing is delivered in figuring out whether this prediction is going to come true. In the text, she describes how gene editing would become part of the IVF process. And so my kind of suspicion here is that if it is part of the IVF process, then it's unlikely that gene editing would become sort of a mandatory norm of good parenting. And that's because, when you know about what IVF involves, it's really detailed and really burdensome. So there's egg harvesting followed by in vitro fertilization, so fertilizing the egg in a petri dish. Then genetic sequencing of the resulting embryo. This is the part of the gene editing. Then editing the genes based on the information provided by the sequencing. Then implantation of the edited embryos, followed by pregnancy and childbirth. So physically, this involves a lot. So egg harvesting involves multiple hormone injections with associated side effects. The risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome you would take on when you're harvesting eggs. And from what I understand, this is really unpleasant. It can actually kill you. egg harvesting and embryo implantation involve multiple transvaginal ultrasounds. I don't have a vagina, but it sounds like something I would want to avoid. That's my only joke, sorry. There's more drugs. On top of it all, you have to think of all the additional appointments to the doctor that would be involved in getting pregnant, just to get pregnant, when for many people, getting pregnant is otherwise easy.
And fun.
And fun, yes. So recognizing all of these burdens in detail suggests to me that it's unlikely that a social norm would develop in which doing all of this would seem mandatory. And what's telling to me is, so some of the quotes and the evidence that she cites to suggest that some people think that this sort of thing would be mandatory, they're actually talking about different things other than this kind of IVF process that involves sequencing and gene editing and then reimplantation and so on. So the Sick Kids study, James's study that she cited, is actually all about postnatal genetic testing, comparatively easier, quote unquote easier, certainly less burdensome on pregnant individuals. So the other examples, the 23andMe one, the Francis Collins example, there are people talking about either prenatal genetic testing or whole genome sequencing of newborns. And when it comes to the non-invasive prenatal testing discussion, the whole idea that prenatal testing the worry that it's going to become mandatory has emerged as a result of the fact that prenatal testing has become so much easier. So there's sort of a coincidence of the easiness of it and the worry that it's going to become mandatory. So all of these things, so postnatal genetic testing or postnatal whole genome sequencing or prenatal genetic testing, they seem a lot different from prenatal sequencing and editing as part of an IVF pregnancy. So postnatal genetic testing and whole genome sequencing and prenatal testing don't have the same physical burdens associated with the whole IVF process. That seems to be the process that she's saying would be used for gene editing, at least the way it's envisioned right now. So perhaps a closer analogy to the process, this IVF process, is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, which is already available and part of sort of a standard part of IVF these days. So with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, you undergo IVF, so that whole process of egg harvesting and then fertilization outside the body, and then before implantation, you test the resulting embryos for a suite of genetic conditions, and you stipulate the kind of ones that you want to avoid. And then you only implant the embryos without these genetic conditions that you want to avoid. And so PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, would actually be, these days, a better option than sequencing and gene editing during IVF for parents who want to avoid giving birth to a child with a heritable serious genetic illness. So if you, for instance, if you know you're a carrier of a serious genetic illness, you want your children to avoid it, there's already this available to you. You can go through IVF and have PGD and then implant only the embryos that don't have or don't carry the condition that you want to avoid. It involves fewer steps and probably less cognitive burden. So for that kind of scenario where you know you have a condition, that there's a risk that you'd be passing on to your children, PGD is an option. It seems to be a better option than actually editing genes, as a way of avoiding that condition. So what's interesting about PGD and IVF, even though it's a pretty kind of similar kind of thing that Josephine's talking about, at least gene editing as part of IVF. What's interesting about PGD is that there doesn't seem to be a really large demand for IVF and PGD right now, except amongst people with fertility issues or single people or gay, lesbian, trans individuals or couples. And to me, since there isn't a really high demand for this outside of those groups, it suggests to me that there is no norm of good parenting that pushes people to undertake this kind of genetic testing as a part of a really burdensome process like IVF. So if that's the case, then maybe there won't be a similar norm of for the more demanding process of IVF sequencing and then gene editing, if that's the way gene editing is delivered. So all that said, if gene editing is developed in a way so it's delivered in an easier fashion, so you can imagine maybe scenarios where gene editing could be done, I don't know how, maybe done in utero somehow, postnatally somehow, I don't know, then these would be a lot easier, at least regarding the physical burdens that are associated with IVF. You'd avoid all of those burdens. If this sort of method of delivery for gene editing is developed, then the bets are all off. So I mean, the critique that I'm advancing here wouldn't obtain, would be different. So in that case, I could see editing the genes of one's children might become viewed as part of good parenting. And to me, that's personally a frightening prospect. So developing these comments was a way of kind of reassuring myself that, okay, maybe this won't happen, that gene editing maybe won't become sort of a mandatory norm of good parenting. All that said, Josephine's presentation is a welcome meditation on what it means to be a good parent now and in the future. Thanks.
Before I open it up for questions, maybe a quick comment. It makes me think of an issue I have been told immediately by two parents who were wanting to have prenatal genetic testing on an embryo created by both of them. One with a late onset genetic disorder which was non-lethal, related to the sensory capacities of people, and the other retinoblastoma, which they wanted to avoid. And they were actually told by the genetic specialist, or by the prenatal specialist, that they refused to test only for one of the conditions. They said, well, we're happy to help you, but it has to be the two. It's interesting. They didn't pursue it further, but anyway, so these things happen. These are not legally prescribed situations, but there are situations where the kind of indeed prenatal pressure to exclude certain conditions is already present. Anyway, I thought it's interesting to kind of hear both of your comments in that connection. I'll open it up for questions. I'll keep a list, but I'll start with a student. The first one who sent in a question yesterday was Nargis Fargo.
Yeah.
Okay, there.
I'm just going to do one of my questions. It's kind of related to the point brought up. As of right now, there's a lot of genetic testing, prenatal genetic testing in terms of amniocentesis and the like. And it doesn't seem that there's as much social pressure to do that. It is personal choice, so people do decline it. So based off that, what inspired you to craft the argument that the pressure will come about if right now we have things in place and they're still not being taken?
This is tricky insofar as I kind of want you to be right, but I fear that you're not, similarly. I think more of these technologies are taken up than these questions suggest, actually. And I think the mentality that there is a future in which they will be more readily taken up is already quite present in a lot of the discourse around genetics in the research context. There is this thing called reproductive benefit or reproductive planning benefit that is kind of an emerging benefit of having your genome sequenced, is even if we can't tell you anything that you can do anything about in your own health, it might be helpful for your reproductive planning. And there are children and adolescents whose genomes are sequenced in research contexts because they are usually the kids who have something going on anyway, and they're in the genetics clinic and then they're enrolled in these studies. And sometimes they don't find out anything from the genome sequencing about the actual condition because we don't know that much yet, among other reasons. But they'll find something else because there's always something in your genome for sure. and they'll return that to the adolescent or the child, and on the basis that it will be helpful for their reproductive planning. And so baked into that idea, unspoken, is the idea that you will actually now use this information to avoid having a child with that genetic variant, whatever it is. And really the only ways to do that now are through these high-tech interventions, right? And it turns out probably that most of the people they're telling us to will A, not be able to afford it, or B, will just get pregnant some other way. But it then means that they sort of didn't do what they were told they could do, what they should do. So I'm on the one hand, I think like, yeah, they're really expensive, invasive, horrible things right now. But I also think that the future in which they're used more is fully at work in the discourse of all of Silicon Valley around genetics. Most of the US genome program, which is a gigantically well-financed, huge amounts of research in China, looking at the use of editing and other technologies in embryos. So I think that there is already sort of a significant investment, even just financially, in this future. There's a book called The End of Sex by Hank Greeley that talks about something called easy IVF, which is where they would just use somatic cells, skin cells, to create embryos, and then you could create hundreds or thousands per person and look at them for everything and then tweak them and stuff. So I don't know how realistic. I mean, when I leave the US, this happens to me every time I go to New Zealand and I start talking about some of this stuff. I feel like I'm like speaking crazy talk. What are you talking about? But honestly, this is hugely like invested in the US context and in other countries. That we will, in fact, not you, but my kid, who's 9, that she will have far more genetic information about her own genome, and that she will use that information to at least select against certain traits in her and my, I'm so in a fancy land here, my grandchildren, right? Like that she will at least use it to select against. Whether it's because she can do easy IVF or whether she does, hard IVF. And I will note that like it's awesome to hear you say that about IVF, but like the idea that IVF is burdensome on lonely women it's just not talked about. It should be talked about a lot more. But no one seems to care much about that so far. So it's nice to think that people start caring about how burdensome IVF is on the people who have to go through egg retrieval. But it hasn't been the discourse thus far, right? In like 40 years of IVF, there hasn't been a whole lot of attention paid to the fact that it's onerous for the people involved. So I don't feel super optimistic about that. And I think families who have a history of inherited disease do in fact feel a significant obligation to go through IVF and PGD. And as more and more of us come to see that we have things that we could pass on that are bad, there will then be a larger audience, larger kind of customer base for that same thing. I don't know, I'd love to be wrong, right? Like I'd love to be like, no, we just don't do that, we just keep doing it the old way, but it's not the future I see being invested in.
Maybe Chris briefly as well.
So,
On that particular question, yeah.
Wasn't really prepared to provide an answer to that. Josephine was good. So do you want to repeat the question?
It has to do with the fact that as of right now, it does seem like a choice to engage in prenatal testing, and that pressure, that norm isn't there as much. I'm not entirely sure, but that's the idea behind it. So what would cause the shift? Because the argument does rely on that.
There are like countries where 90% of people who have a Down syndrome diagnosis prenatally terminate the pregnancy. You could say that's just because that's full choice, or you could say that there's social pressure at work. There's a lot. You've got a whole book on this stuff.
Well, things are changing, right? So the technology is getting better, it's getting easier, and you do see more and more of the discussion around the idea that it's going to become sort of mandatory, quasi-mandatory, not required, but quasi-mandatory. So that's the fear, yeah. The other thing is it's not just ease of use, but it's accuracy along with ease of use. So one of the things that sort of prevented some of the screening processes prenatally from becoming sort of taken up in a widespread fashion was the fact that the screenings were really inaccurate for a long time. and they're getting better. To the point that there's even the suggestion that pretty soon you won't need things like an amniocentesis, which has a risk of miscarriage, which is a real deterrent for some people. It's a very small risk, but it's a deterrent. But if you eliminate that risk and you have pretty clear diagnostic information using just a blood test, then a lot of people are going to say, well, why wouldn't you just do it? It's just a blood test, right?
And it's already, I mean, it's nice that prenatal screening is routinized in US context and in many countries. People don't even remember that it was a choice that they made. Amnio, yes, because it's a big deal. You really have to go to a different place for it. It's like a thing like a decision point. But other kinds of testing that happen in prenatal care are routinized to the extent and in a way that is completely inconsistent with any kind of decision choice. Mm-hmm. It's just part of what you do. And I tried to say no to one prenatal test, and God, everybody gets their freaking knickers in a twist when you do that. So no, it's pretty much you have to do it.
Amelia.
You kind of touched on this already, but do you think a shift toward using genetic technology for gene editing might actually come in conflict with advances in disability rights?
Yeah. So disability rights discourse is like one of the wonderful ways in which we have become better humans over the last few decades. I don't take any credit for it. It's not something I've led, but I'm a total beneficiary of that whole literature. That's moral progress. I think it's an example of moral progress, the way in which people now discuss disability and the idea that like everybody's kind of got some sort of disability, which is almost certainly true. Everyone will become disabled in certain ways. That it's like that the way in which that's a richer and more questioning, skeptical discourse, the way we understand the extent to which so many things recognise today as disabilities are socially constructed, the neurotypical movement, like all of those things are like super helpful for creating a kind of support for the idea that this is not how you have to think about these technologies, right? That's the counter-narrative, it's part of the counter-narrative for this stuff, totally. And it's really good, it's a helpful thing. One of the things that's just coming out in the last few months is a whole bunch of research on what are called polygenic risk scores, which is it's a big data kind of approach to genetics. It's not looking at causal mechanisms, but just seeing like are there many small gene variants that when you add them together seem to give an increased risk, knows the word, for certain things. And one of the things that's been measured is educational attainment. So you can get a polygenic risk score for your chance of completing different levels of education. And it's actually in this populations in which the research was done, so it's not universalizable across different countries and ethnic groups or heritages. It's really predictive. And so, they'll be selling polygenic risk score testing for sure for people, and you have a bunch of embryos and some of them will have a higher polygenic risk score than others, and that's really a great, that's something someone is for sure already figuring out how they're going to sell. And so I think disability might be becoming more nuanced, but we're not more nuanced about things like IQ or educational attainment, some other things, other traits that aren't called disability but are highly socially valued or disvalued.
We may get a genetic entry exam to law school.
I mean, I think by the time, I don't know, see, I think that we won't make quite the same mistakes we made in the past, right? We won't do that, but we will do it at the prenatal time. We'll sort prenatally, or pre-implantationally.
Gregory Drosdal.
Yeah, sure, very. So my question relates more to the consequences of the way that you characterize the pressures that parents will be facing. So in your chapter, you contend that asking parents to adhere to that particular conception of a good parent is akin to asking them to cease to understand themselves as persons. So I'm just wondering if there's anything that we can add to that to talk about the consequences, or take the analysis a bit further. Are there data to show that would have an adverse psychological impact? And this might be a pretty obvious answer. Or is it merely wrong in principle?
I think it's wrong in principle. For people to be asked, not directly, right, but to essentially give up on themselves as persons inside of a role that they've they take on, like a role like parenting. Let's just say that role. So I think it's wrong in principle. Whether or not it has negative consequences to sort of cease to exist inside of the parenting role as a person or an individual with a life story and your own values, I don't know that I can point to a study on that. Sometimes when I find myself making this argument, like saying, you know, we've got to allow for a construction of good parenting that makes room for the interests and lives and well-being and flourishing of parents themselves, it seems so obvious. Like, why would you construct good parenting in a way that sort of obviated the parent? And then I'm like, well, I don't know, like if you just change the word parent to mother, it doesn't seem so weird, right? Like, construct the role of good mothering in such a way that the mother ceases to exist as a person. Well, that sounds familiar. So I think we've done it like for a long time, and like now this is not data, okay, this is just my own like experience, but as someone who became a parent in the United States, I felt like I really resisted the narrative around me, which was like, your life is over, you're a different person now, what your needs don't matter, it's all about the like. Don't get me wrong, I think I'm a really good parent, and you can ask other people about that if you have doubts. And I put her in, like, and I don't think, like, part of what's wrong with my paper, if I was critiquing my paper, is that I sort of construct this dichotomy of like parents versus kids in terms of interests, and I don't really think in well-being. I don't think that's how families work. But I need, well, maybe there's a better way to do it, but for the purposes of this paper, I felt like I needed that construct to flush out the issue that I was really interested in, which is like, well, what are the, you know, what does it matter? What does it matter if it's horrible for women to go through IVF, if that's how they can maintain a genetic link to their, if that's how their husbands can maintain a genetic link to their child, then let's just go for it. Like, that's certainly the attitude of when you go in and they diagnose you with male factor infertility, right? No one's like, this is going to be really awful for you. They're like, we have great news. It's male factor infertility, and we have a high success rate with that. Like, that's how they treat it. So, anyway, sorry, I'm getting distracted, but I've experienced a very strong narrative of like, it's not about you, it's about the child in the parenting role, and there's not room in there currently, it feels to me. So that's an experience that I've had, but I don't have like a bunch of studies on that. Sorry. There might be, I should look for them.
Okay, question from the audience. Yep.
I just have a question about the commercial market driving these tests and the role that it plays in creating the kind of information, the literature, the discourse about the technologies. Because I think I'm part of a research team studying non-invasive prenatal tests. It's a very commercially driven market. There are lots of companies. The tests are not regulated, and so they're producing information that is saying, this is reassuring, not giving all the information about the actual test and how it works. And it is an easier test, but I'm just wondering how the market plays out for this particular.
I think the market and the commercial interests are gigantic and then unprecedented in this space. So non-invasive prenatal testing, I'm sure you know this, sort of took obstetrics and gynecology by surprise, right? It's like, whoa, like every other test that we would introduce into clinical practice came through ACOG, which is American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Like, we did the research and then we decided to adopt it, and then non-invasive prenatal testing just came on. There were all these tests, and people in obstetrics felt totally blindsided. Like, this was happening without their cooperation, without their sort of authority. That's the new now, right? Like, that's for sure how it is, and so we have to catch up to that, because you certainly see it that's been the whole story of direct-to-consumer genetics. So outside of reproductive stuff, though direct-to-consumer genetics definitely has reproductive benefit planning baked into it as well. So yeah, I think the commercial interests are great. And they are, they're really hard to control. And they have a really strong narrative and logic, right? And so what I'm interested in doing, not just in this chapter, but like in this book that I'm working on, is like developing the counter narrative, which includes some of the disability stuff, but also this idea of like, how one's own engagement with this changes oneself in ways that may or may not be kind of fulfilling.
Hartley?
Yeah, you started touching on this actually in your presentation, but I was just kind of wondering practically if your predictions come true and we want to go ahead with like making a shift in the culture of how we think about good parenting in the context of genetic editing. Do we do it in how the products are marketed, how the ingredients are marketed? And then you mentioned laws, like what would those laws look like practically?
Yeah. Okay. So some of what I'm going to say tomorrow at the end of the conference is about this. It is the case that, so there might be laws directly related to the technology that could be helpful for modulating the pressure to use it and like making sure people really understand and feel they have a choice, right? So there can be laws or around that. There can be very direct practices and sort of policies of medical ethics, like how do you do good clinical medicine that can address the technology direct, that can be sort of technology based and under that umbrella of technology. But I also know that other laws and policies and practices also have a gigantic impact. So if you live in a culture where there isn't really any good support in your schools or your medical system, or even in your criminal justice system for people who are have particular genetic conditions, whatever, or differences. If you live in, so let's take autism, right? So when they get polygenic risk scores for autism going, which is just right happening, and you live in a culture where like people with autism are more likely to be arrested, people with autism are less likely to receive the services, and if you live in that kind of place where there are not those kinds of laws and policies in place to support that kind of genetic difference, then you can go through a lovely informed consent process where you fully understand what you're doing, what you're being offered and blah, blah, blah. But like the other laws and policies that are missing will be so overwhelming in shaping your decision that you may feel you don't really have a choice, right? So we do a great job, I think, in reproductive stuff sometimes of classifying people's choices, calling things choices that are actually super, super constrained by various financial and social and policy questions that haven't been adequately addressed. And so those are the kinds of laws and policies where I think you can make a big difference. And like they're things we want to do anyway, right? Like you probably do a great job in Canada again. Like it's so easy to idolize Canada when you live in America. I have no idea. People like you're going to Canada for Thanksgiving, they're like, oh, will you come back? To me stuff. People are just desperate down there right now. But it's not the case everywhere, and we can always do better. So I think those are where a lot of the action can take place, so that you create a kind of a more welcoming society for people with different kinds of ways of thinking.
Okay, so I have five more questions on the list.
Oh.
What I'll suggest is that people just formulate their questions as briefly as possible, and then you can see what you're able to respond. So I would suggest Annette and Nara. And then I have Patrick, View, and Ian. Okay, so start with Annette.
Hi. Formally, as quickly as possible. Okay, I was just curious about how, if and why you think this perceived moral obligation of the parents to use this technology would survive the counseling.
Okay. I'll just. Do you want to just go through the questions and then?
Yes, yeah. Take the questions down.
I actually had the same question in part B. I had the same question in part B.
Okay. And then Patrick.
Hi. So in the relationship between law and technology, like in a case like this, oftentimes we have this narrative where laws are lagging behind technology, lagging behind science. I'm curious to know if among proponents of gene editing, gene sequencing, and all this stuff, if that kind of narrative, how's the law sort of framed? Is it this vestigial, slow burden on everything that we should just, if only legal people would get their act together? Or anyway, curious to hear your thoughts.
I had a question of clarification, mostly in regards to criticism. So were you saying that CRISPR-Cas9 could be a potential, have potential therapeutic use with respect to in utero and postnatal applications? And are you finding that that's the case, where like you can use it as an intervention at that point?
Okay, and then you're finished?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, you talked about gene editing in association with IVF, which we all know is difficult and expensive. Are you concerned about when there's an opportunity to select for things like height, intelligence, that there's maybe sort of exacerbating the distance between classes and sort of calcifying classes for future generations?
Okay, is that it? All right, so I'm going to go backwards, which means I might need the first question repeated. Could it be used to exacerbate class differences? Yeah, it could be used to do that. It might also be the case that it would be, as you could argue about IVF actually, like rich people who get access to something horrible, right? But if it can actually confer social advantage, then sure, it would definitely be something you could use to further differentiate yourself from other people's, make better kids, right? You're going to make better kids, whatever that means. And certainly, yeah, possibly, right? I do think that. Are the laws lagging behind science, and is that the narrative? So, yeah, I don't necessarily think the laws are lagging behind the science, but that is the narrative. So, certainly you see that around the prohibition on germline modification. The narrative is like, oh, well, that was a line in the sand that we drew as a compromise, like decades ago when we couldn't do it. But now look how we could use it really helpfully. Like, we need to update the laws. For sure, that's the narrative. It's also just kind of coincidentally, but not peripherally. Peripherally, but not coincidentally, the narrative outside of human uses. So in New Zealand has laws on genetically modified organisms and is actually officially GMO free. And so totally people are like, oh my God, we have to change the laws. Like, that's obviously not something so that's definitely the narrative outside there as well. So whether we can debate whether that's right or wrong, but that's the sort of story. And the social consequences of changing laws to accommodate science once science catches up with where the line in the sand was are like almost never discussed, but they're huge. And then I'll leave you the other question about the genetic counselling question. Were you asking how genetic counselling features into the discussions of this issue, or?
It just seems strange to me that given we have an entire field dedicated to sort of helping the average person understand the consequences of some of this and all this stuff we don't know still, that parents would still sort of hold on to that moral obligation, or at the very least that somebody could insist that somebody's being a bad parent, given all that information that science is telling you about how unreliable some of this is.
Yeah. So I forget the number of genetic counsellors in the United States, but it is so tiny compared to the number of people taking genetic tests that the idea that everybody offered a genetic test can get counselling from a genetic counsellor is totally impossible right now. It doesn't mean that there couldn't one day be this gigantic workforce that does that, and that workforce could help people understand what it is they're up to. One of the things that I would like to see that workforce do is include some of this stuff about sort of the burdens on parents of going down these routes, and like not just be like explaining the I mean, I don't mean to be mean about genetic counsellors because they do an amazing job, but like, and maybe some people do talk about this other stuff, but it's in medical ethics, we've understood informed consent in the genetics context to involve a lot of explanation of how the technology works and what the conditions are it can look for and how accurate it is for those different conditions, okay? And that is what informed consent amounts to. That's the informed part. There's much less attention to things like what's the experience like, what do we know about how this is for people. Like, we now know that going through, that if you get expanded prenatal testing, diagnostic testing, that uncertain findings in that context are very, very, very difficult for people to deal with and cause gigantic distress. We have, I don't know if it's a norm of genetic counselling to tell people that as well, right? Here's what we know about the experience and what it's like for people and what we've been learning about how to do this right. Like, so I don't believe that it's a fully, what counts as informed consent is in the kind of counselling that it could include some other things, or it could be expanded somewhat to include some of the stuff about parental well-being. But yeah, if you're going to get a genetic test, you're really lucky if you get to talk to a genetic counsellor before or after, or both, because that's like this best case scenario, really. Do you want to
So the CRISPR-Cas9. So here's how I think it's being used now. I think it's kind of up in the air how it could be used in the future. So there have been some studies where CRISPR-Cas9 has been used to alter embryos, which would have germline changes, so there'd be heritable changes that would pass on to the next generation. And tell me if you heard anything more. I know that it's being used to engineer T cells that can be used for immune therapy and treatment of cancer, for like leukemia. So you have donated cells that are changed using CRISPR and then implanted into the patient, someone who's different. They're sort of engineered to make them compatible with the person and used to combat the leukemia.
Yeah, and there is animal research on in utero gene editing for something like, so some candidates in humans would be like cystic fibrosis or haemophilia. So that cystic fibrosis in particular that's identified during the pregnancy, especially early on, and then if you could do gene editing in the early development of the fetus, there's every chance that it would impact germ cells as well, right? So the kind of germline somatic distinction has got a bit of a fuzzy line in the middle where there could be partial impact on germ cells or full impact on germ cells of interventions done in utero, or even maybe as in children, depending. So that distinction is a little problematic because the line isn't as clean as we think it is.
Last 2 words about Patrick's question, or?
Well, I did, I think.
Okay.
Yeah,
that was okay.
he's right. Can I just say one thing, which is that this is my first time that I've ever had like a commentator on a paper I wrote, or like and it's a real privilege to have a colleague or comment on your work like this, and for all of you to engage. So I just want to say how grateful I am for you to giving me that time.
So thank you so much. This was really stimulating and dynamic. Thank you.